Hello, my name is Kevin Hind and this is an introductory economics talk on the issues of scarcity and choice. These are the fundamental problems in economics, and what we're going to look at in this particular session is how we resolve the scarcity problem or scarcity challenge through economic growth and trade. Economics is fundamentally about choice and scarcity, resolving how people, organisations and governments make choices and how they try and resolve the problem of scarcity of resources. We assume that people actually have infinite wants. They have limitless wants. These wants are clearly changing all the time. But if we look at our wants, these are far beyond our basic needs, beyond the basic needs of feeding ourselves, giving ourselves water, giving ourselves warmth and giving ourselves shelter. But the problem is that we cannot satisfy these wants because resources are scarce, both on the demand and the supply side. And this is quite important to grasp right at the outset. We're using a wide definition of the word resources. For example, we're including things like physical and human capital constraints. Now, in that particular instance, you might think about organisations who try and produce goods and services to satisfy our wants, but that they say that there's some form of skill shortages or labour shortages. So that would be an example of scarcity. But also there are individuals who maybe in making choices don't have full information about the goods and services on offer, or they may actually have time constraints. They may want to engage in a particular activity, but they cannot because they've chosen something else as being a more preferable experience to buying a particular service. So there are time constraints, and of course there are income constraints for consumers and for suppliers. So the concept of scarcity is pervasive, and it occurs for a variety of reasons, because we have scarcity of a whole range of resources, physical and human capital constraints. We have limited information, limited time, and also limited money income. The problem of scarcity is so pervasive it exists for consumers, producers and governments. Consumers are always making choices about what goods and services they desire most. Businesses are making choices about the input mix they need to make particular output, and governments are making choices about schools and roads, what ones are more important than others. And because we have this scarcity issue, we are making these choices. And I've put down a few examples in addition to the ones I just mentioned. But if you think about an individual, they may be choosing to attend university, and let's say instead of engaging in some form of work activity where they'd be earning money. So clearly there's an opportunity cost of attending the university in terms of the wages that you forego or the income that you forego from taking up work now. Likewise, an organisation is choosing things like robots over people in the making of particular products. Now it may well be that they've been moved in that direction, maybe because there's some form of the price of labour has risen, but the reality is that organisations are making choices like that. They're thinking about the input mix in order to make the output that we desire. And governments, I mentioned, are making choices about whether or not we should have schools or roads, or we should have hospitals, or in this particular instance I've shown here, a government is choosing to invest in military expenditure as opposed to food production. You could express that in terms of the kilos of food foregone for the tanks built. This is a classic guns versus butter argument. You think about military dictatorships that maybe have engaged in a lot of military production rather than feeding their people. So it's a key issue. The point about choice is it involves a trade-off, and we are giving up something to get something else, and the highest valued alternative that we're giving up is known as the opportunity cost of the activity chosen. So to repeat, what we have is we have infinite wants, but there are limited resources. We are making choices, but in making choices there is an opportunity cost involved in making that choice. So how can we resolve the problem of scarcity? And that's what I wanted to have a look at now in a first look at economic growth. And we'll explain what economic growth is in a moment, but we're going to use some diagrams which are a key instrument of explaining economic reasoning in order to explore the issues we've already come up against and the issue of economic growth. Now in this particular diagram we've got a country and it's got two particular products that it can choose between. It's got guns or butter, so military equipment or food production if you like, and the point that's being made here is that you could achieve a point like OG if this particular country devoted all its inputs, all its resources to making guns, and it would produce OG guns. That would be a physical amount of guns. Now in doing that it wouldn't produce any butter, it wouldn't produce any food, but an alternative would be to put all its resources, all its inputs, all its skills, all its land, all its machines into making butter, and it would produce 0B in terms of butter units. Of course then it wouldn't produce any guns, but that's a choice it would be making. It may of course make some intermediate choice like W, which would be indicative of an efficient use of inputs. Point OG and OB are points in which we would have efficient use of inputs to make our output. So you'd be maximising the possibility of producing the most for your society with the given resources that you have at your disposal. And GB is known as a production possibility frontier or production possibility curve because it represents an efficient use of resources, and you're maximising your output with your given input mix. And you might choose a point like W, which we'll come back to in a moment. If you actually achieve a point like A, then you're inside the production possibility curve, and of course that's indicative of underutilisation of resources. You're actually using your resources inefficiently, and you don't want to be there. So economists are constantly looking at how we can get our input mix correct, efficient, so we can make the most output we possibly can with the resources that we have available. A point like W is chosen in various ways. It may well be determined by the market. It's indicative of what people want to consume in terms of guns and butter is equal to what producers of guns and butter are willing to supply. It's also indicative perhaps of what governments want us to produce. There might be some state production of military equipment and butter, for example. Whatever it is, what we're interested in is the efficient production of guns and butter, and W is a point in which would represent efficiency, and it would be representative of the choices made through markets or through government dictation. So on our production possibility frontier, GB, a point like W would indicate that we would produce 0G star of guns and 0B star of butter. Clearly it would be good if we could actually consume more of that. At any moment in time, a line like GB indicates the production possibilities at some period, call it time period 0, and you would be making some choice like W at that particular time. However, if we had economic growth, that is, in this particular diagram we're showing that we can increase the production of both guns and butter, and that we would achieve points like X, Y or Z, or G1 or B1, that we would be on this improved production and therefore consumption possibility for this society. So G1, B1 would be indicative of, let's say, time period 1, whereas the line GB would be indicative of time period 0. We have over time improve the level of production of guns and butter, and that would be indicative of economic growth, and we'll explain what lies behind economic growth in a moment. But let's just have a look at this line G1B1. At point W on the old production possibility, GB, we were producing G star and B star in terms of guns and butter respectively. But now we have a choice. We could, for example, move from W to X as a society and produce more guns and keep the same amount of production and consumption of butter at B star. We could of course go to from a point like W to Y, and we would be producing still G star in terms of guns, but now more butter. And alternatively, we could be at a point like Z where we were producing more guns and more butter. The choice is up to this particular nation. It depends upon the way markets interact, way consumers and producers interact, to determine what people want with what's wanted with what's produced, and also by government. Another way of actually getting economic growth is through improvements in the production of one good or service. In this particular diagram, what we've shown is that actually there's been improvements in butter production. The line production possibility line GB has now pivoted around G, so we've got GB1 in terms of amounts of guns and butter that we could produce. So we've got certainly new amounts of butter, and indeed, as it turns out, because of the improvement in butter production, we've actually got new opportunities for increasing our production and consumption of guns. So again, let's look at our initial position. We were at W, consuming 0 G star of guns and 0 B star of butter, but now we have the possibility, interestingly, of keeping the same amount of butter, B star, and moving to a point like X and having more guns. So what does this mean? Well, this clearly means that the improvement in technology or in economic growth and prosperity in butter production has led to us having the opportunity to switch our resources, some of our resources may be in butter, to producing more guns and keeping the same amount of butter consumption. We could of course move from W to Y, as we showed before, keeping the number of guns that we produce at G star and having more butter. Or again, we can have some intermediate position like Z. And again, the choices are up to this nation. They're due to markets. The choices that we make, the point that we want to achieve on GB1 is up to this particular society, and they are determined by markets. That point is determined by markets and by governments. So numerous points between G and B1 can be chosen, but economists are again looking for efficient use of resources to make the maximum output possible at that particular moment in time. So we would want to be along the line G, B1. We would want to maximise our production possibilities. Here we've shown it through economic growth. But what exactly is economic growth? Well, we've got a definition there, and economic growth is illustrated by an increase in output per person in the economy over time. And it is interesting to note that there are two key ingredients which influence economic growth. One is technological change. Changes in technology can be labour saving, or they could be capital enhancing, so that we could get better computers, for example. So we can get inventions or we can get innovations. The distinction is inventions are something new, whereas innovations are improvements on existing techniques. But the point about technology is it shifts the production possibility frontier over time, so that we get these improvements in economic prosperity. We're resolving the scarcity problem through technological change. Another way of getting economic growth is through what's called capital accumulation. The best way of thinking about this is through what I call the Robinson Crusoe scenario. If you know the story of Robinson Crusoe, he was marooned on an island, and he has to live for himself. Essentially, he's got his own little economy, and he's got the same economic problems that we all have. He's got infinite wants, and he wants to try and maximise those wants through producing goods and services that he desires most of all. So, for example, he wants to feed himself, let's say, with fish. But in order to improve his lot in terms of maybe, let's say, spending time on making something else, he would not want to spend all his time catching fish. So he might forego current consumption of fish, make a net, and then that would allow him to catch more fish. And the fact that he can catch more fish means that he doesn't actually have to engage in some form of fishing all the time. He can maybe spend his time on something else. So capital accumulation can help to provide opportunities to improve economic prosperity. It gives us opportunity to do something else, use our resources. In the case of Crusoe, use his time and labour on some other activity that he wants. And it's exactly the same for modern societies. Okay, so we've looked at how economic growth, in an introductory way, can resolve the problem of scarcity for society. But what about trade? That's a key ingredient as well, as we'll show, to resolving the scarcity problem. And what we're going to show is that we can consume beyond our production possibility frontier if we engage in trade. In other words, if we didn't engage in trade, we'd be in a worse off position than if we actually engage in trade with some neighbouring nation or some other nation. The basis for trade is, well, there are two things that lie behind the basis for trade. Adam Smith, for example, back in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, stated that the basis for trade was due to absolute advantage. And a country would have an absolute advantage in the production of two goods if, by using the same inputs, that country can produce more of both goods than another country. So you could have a big country, and that would be, use its advantage to trade. Well, David Ricardo saw that there was another dimension to trade, because of course absolute advantage only explains part of the modern trade. And David Ricardo suggested that actually what you've also got to think about is comparative advantage. That is the relative productivity in particular countries. And in terms of comparative advantage, a country would have a comparative advantage in an activity if that country can perform the activity at a lower opportunity cost than any other country. And if it does have that comparative advantage, then it should specialise in those goods in which it has the comparative advantage and trade those goods for other goods in which it's got a comparative disadvantage. And this is a key ingredient of trade. It's something that underpins the wealth of nations. And we see today that we have lots of interference, lots of protectionism, and the point that Ricardo is making is if we allow markets to be free and fair, then we will get benefits for our society. So that's what we're going to show, again using our diagram, our production possibility frontier diagram. In our example, we're going to look at two countries, a less developed country and a developed country, and they've got two products that they can both produce and consume domestically. There's wheat and there's cloth. Wheat is measured in millions of kilos and cloth is measured in millions of metres. In this example, these numbers are due to John Sloman's book Economics. What we can see is that the developed country has an absolute advantage in producing both wheat and cloth. It could produce 1,200 million kilos of wheat or 2,400 million metres of cloth, whereas the less developed country can produce less of both of those, 1,000 million kilos of wheat and 500 million metres of cloth. But it's also important to note that the developed country has a comparative advantage in producing cloth, because it's nearly 5 times greater at producing cloth than the less developed country. So it's almost 5 times as efficient at producing cloth than the less developed country, but it's only 1.2 times greater at producing wheat. The less developed country, on the other hand, is 5/24, just over 20%, almost 21% as efficient as the developed country in producing cloth, but 5/6, or 83.3% as efficient as the developed country in producing wheat. It has less of a comparative disadvantage in producing wheat. So what this means is that the less developed country should be producing wheat and only wheat, and then trading that wheat with the developed country, who would be producing, specialising in producing just cloth. And what we'll show is that both countries can gain, and we'll show that in terms of a production and consumption possibility frontier. An alternative way of saying the same thing, of course, is that if the less developed country produces 1 extra unit of wheat, it must forego half a cloth unit, but if it produces 1 extra cloth unit, it must forego 2 wheat units. The developed country, on the other hand, if it produces 1 extra wheat unit, it must forego 2 cloth units, but if it wants 1 more cloth unit, it only gives up half a wheat unit. So these are the opportunity costs of 1 extra wheat unit in terms of cloth foregone, or 1 extra cloth unit in terms of wheat foregone. So what this means in total is that the less developed country finds it more costly to forego wheat production, while the developed country finds it more costly to forego cloth production, and that therefore each country should specialise in those goods in which they have a comparative advantage in trade. That is, again, less developed country should produce wheat, and the developed country should produce cloth, and they should trade those goods between each other. And so what we're going to do is show this particular issue in terms of the production possibility frontier. Although we had a production possibility frontier in the growth section of this particular presentation, the point is that we have both production and consumption possibilities here. And what we've done here is shown the less developed country. It's got both wheat and cloth, so we could be producing, if this country used all its resources to produce wheat, it could produce 1,000 million kilos of wheat, be at point A. It wouldn't produce any cloth, but alternatively it could produce, for example, at point F, if it devoted all its resources, all its inputs to making cloth, it would produce 500 million metres of cloth, but no wheat. It could, of course, choose some intermediate position between A and F. It could choose something like B, C, D or E. Now the slope of this graph is indicative of the opportunity cost ratio of cloth in terms of wheat foregone, or wheat in terms of cloth foregone. So if you look at the movement from A to F, for example, it's a straight line, so it's a constant throughout, constant costing throughout this particular for this particular country. If it gave up, if it wanted 1 extra cloth unit, it would have to give up 2 wheat units. So clearly it's very expensive for this particular country to give up wheat. We've done exactly the same for the developed country, although the scale of the graph is different, just to fit it on the screen. But basically what we've shown here is that we could be at a point like G, that is, if the developed country put all its resources in producing wheat, it would produce 1,200 million kilos of wheat and no cloth units. Alternatively, it could be a point like M, where it produce 2,400 million metres of cloth, but no wheat, or again some intermediate position, H, I, J, K or L. And in this particular instance, again, we can show the opportunity cost of wheat in terms of cloth, or cloth foregone, or cloth in terms of wheat foregone. And the point is here that if you want one extra wheat unit, then you need to give up 2 cloth units in order to get that extra wheat unit. So it's very expensive to give up cloth for the developed country. So what points do these countries choose? Well, I'm going to make an assumption about that, but remember, these are both production and consumption possibilities for both the less developed and the developed country. We could be at any point from A to F if you're a less developed country, both producing and consuming cloth and wheat, or any point between G and M for the developed country, consuming and producing wheat or cloth. So what I'm going to suggest is that the countries, less developed country, produces at D, that is, it decides to produce and consume 400 million kilos of wheat and 300 million meters of cloth, whereas the developed country produces 600 million kilos of wheat and consumes that amount, and produces and consumes 1200 million meters of cloth. So what we're going to show is how we can get beyond these points. How can both the less developed country and the developed country actually consume at least more of one of these goods? Ultimately, we could show it producing more, consuming more of both of these goods through trade, but we're just going to show it consuming at least the same of one good and actually consuming more of the other good. And we're going to base that on the principles that we noted earlier. That is, each country will specialise in what it's good at and trade with the other. So to summarise, what we have is a pre-trade exchange ratios. That is, if they don't trade with each other, the less developed country has 2 wheat for 1 cloth, and the developed country has 1 wheat for 2 cloth. Now, if they trade, then what should happen is that the less developed country should export wheat, which it has the comparative advantage in, whereas the developed country should be exporting cloth. Clearly one country's exports and another country's imports. And we're going to make an assumption that the exchange ratios for cloth for wheat are 1 for 1. So the less developed country is willing to trade 1 wheat for 1 cloth, and the developed country is going to trade 1 wheat for 1 cloth. And trade will take place as long as the relative price ratios are between the relative opportunity cost ratios. So in this particular case, what we've got is an exchange rate of 1 cloth for 1 wheat. So that's between the pre-trade exchange ratios we've shown here. So if we show the consumption possibilities, this will be the yellow line. Obviously we've got a 1 for 1 trade-off here, that the less developed country could have 1,000 million kilos of wheat, and if it's trading 1 for 1, 1,000 million meters of cloth. That would be a 1 for 1. So indeed, the less developed country is going to specialise in the production of wheat, and then it's going to trade some of that wheat for some cloth with the developed country. The developed country, of course, will specialise in cloth production because that's what it's best at doing, and it could then trade 1 for 1 unit of cloth for 1 wheat unit, and ultimately it could, although clearly the less developed country is much smaller, it could in theory achieve 2,400 million kilos of wheat. Okay, so let's have a look at what happens then when we engage in some form of trade. Okay, what we're going to assume is that the trade that takes place here is that they exchange 600 of each. So in the less developed country, they're right at the top producing 1,000 million kilos of wheat. They're not producing any cloth, so they're right at the very top here, and they're going to export 600 million kilos of wheat. They're obviously going to export that to the developed country, and they're going to import some cloth from the developed country. So on a one-for-one basis, they're going to import 600 million metres of cloth from the developed country. So remember that they were at point D before they engaged in trade. So point D was where they had 400 million kilos of wheat and 300 million metres of cloth. That's what they produced and consumed. But now, because they've specialised in wheat and traded that wheat for cloth, they actually get the opportunity of consuming more cloth, an extra 300 million metres per annum. So here they've moved from point D to point X. They have increased their consumption possibility